Alright y'all, so today in this video I wanted to kind of do an interesting deep dive into one of the more infamous sequels ever made. Of course, we're going to be talking about Son of the Mask. In this canceled video, I'm going to be talking about basically most of the cut content that we got from that movie. Some ideas that just never made it to screen, concept art pieces, even fully animated and completed scenes, as there's surprisingly a lot of alternate scenes, deleted scenes, and just a lot of cut content, every movie does naturally, that never made it to the big screen. I also want to talk about a supposed director's cut of the film, the so-called Gutterman cut that, later on, years later, the director himself of Son of the Mask and even Jamie Kennedy on his own YouTube channel spoke about that they apparently had a director's cut. It was supposedly a lot better than the theatrical version that we got released back in 2005, and that, there's just a lot of really interesting cut elements that we could have gotten from Son of the Mask. So I just kind of wanted to make a video about it. I don't really see too many people talk about this, at least on YouTube at the time of making this. And I thought it was all really fascinating stuff. So wanted to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive into the cut content of Son of the Mask, the supposed canceled stuff, if you will. Now, like all my other canceled videos, I'm going to give you a little bit of background, what the cut content actually was, why ultimately a lot of this never made it to the big screen, and my overall opinions on everything. So regardless, let's get into the Son of the Mask cut content. So for a little bit of a background, my personal opinion on Son of the Mask, I have not really been a huge fan of this movie, admittedly. Now, I actually liked this movie quite a bit as a kid. I actually loved this movie as a kid. I don't really know if it's was ever on the same level as the first one, but I just really enjoyed it. I thought it was crazy, it was goofy, it was zany, and, I appreciated it for what it was. Now, as an adult, I will say that it's not quite as bad as some other films that I have seen over the years. I think there's a lot of things in this movie that work really well. I think the baby and the dog stuff is really cool and unique. I even think Kennedy's approach to the mask and his character are pretty interesting. And I appreciate that this movie was not trying to be another Jim Carrey mask-led vehicle, right? They were trying to do something different with a different premise and a different concept. Now, I'm not sure if that was really the exact approach that they really should have gone with a sequel, but I do appreciate the attempt to be something different and original. So I appreciate the movie, and I think some of it works, but I do think it falls flat on its face, especially when you compare it to the Jim Carrey version. Regardless, leading to the Son of the Mask, I already mentioned this a little bit in my canceled Mask 2 video, but originally in the 90s, after the first Mask came out, there was a pretty big push to make a sequel. Now, initially, there was talks, Chuck Russell was thinking about doing it again. There was potential ideas that they were going to possibly use Tina as the Mask this time around. Carrie was going to be originally involved with this one. Possibly Walter was going to be involved, and it was going to have some kind of plot revolving around being in Las Vegas or Paris, and maybe even a Christmas movie. All those early ideas and treatments, and we know that Chuck Russell had a fully completed script for The Mask 2, ultimately never happened, mainly due to a combination of Carrey not wanting to come back, despite having a pretty big offer to do so, but also just in general, many of the creatives just kind of moving on from the project. Since Carrey didn't want to be involved, that kind of was the catalyst, if you will, for why the project never happened. And ultimately, the project died a very early death. But the idea of doing a sequel was never lost on New Line, and eventually development on it kicked back up around 2001 when they got this writer called Lance Kazi. I don't know if I'm saying that name correctly, but he was hired in 2001 to write the script, and the idea for the sequel to Son of the Mask actually formed from a scene, reportedly, in Chuck Russell's The Mask 2 script. There was apparently a scene in that script where I guess the mask just somehow got away from Tina or Stanley, and apparently the mask got onto a random baby, and it was, like I said, only one scene in that script. But the idea that the baby could be infused with the mask powers, I guess, was such a cool idea, they developed the concept for the Son of the Mask from that original scene. And eventually it got fully formed into the script that we got and the movie that we eventually did get. Lawrence Gutterman was hired on to direct. He had directed Cats and Dogs back in 2001, which was a pretty big hit at that time and was seen as a kind of a family-friendly hit. And New Line kind of wanted to make a sequel in line with his family-friendly tendencies from that movie. So he was hired on to direct. And Gutterman was kind of a huge, prospect in the film industry at that time. He had directed a short film that was beloved by Steven Spielberg, and he also went to many prestigious film schools, and was seen as a really just a studious man, like a guy that definitely knew the craft of filmmaking. So he was hired on to direct Son of the Mask, and eventually the script was fully formed. And when apparently asked about the differences between The Mask and his upcoming film, The Son of the Mask, he kind of compared it to Alien and Aliens, right? Where they're just basically completely different films. The Son of the Mask is trying to do something completely different, which, makes sense, right? I mean, I think it's a good way to describe Son of the Mask, because it's kind of unfair to compare it because they are really entirely different films, and they're going for completely different things. Now, apparently when they were casting the movie, especially for the character of Ted, there were multiple actors considered where they eventually landed on Jamie Kennedy. Apparently Jack Black, Chris Rock, Will Ferrell, Owen Wilson, Marlon Wayne, Steve Carell were apparently offered the role, but they all turned it down. I really am curious why they all turned it down. Even Ryan Reynolds was apparently offered the role, and I think he really wanted to do it, but he had to turn it down because he was working on an even better movie. And I'm being very sarcastic when I'm saying this, but Blade Trinity, which would eventually release a year later in 2006. So that's kind of crazy. Now, the studio was really wanting Jamie Kennedy to be the role of Ted. I guess they really were impressed by his work. And he also had a really big hit film at that time, Malibu's Most Wanted. Kind of one of those really funny films from the early 2000s. And he was kind of seen as this huge up-and-coming comedian talent, if you will. He had his own show, even, if you don't remember. It's called the Jamie Kennedy Experiment, which is kind of this weird improv show, and he's kind of doing all these characters and skits. That was kind of one of his styles of his humor. He would just play multiple characters and do funny little impressions and personalities. So kind of compared to Jim Carrey, but not quite as funny, in my opinion. But New Line really wanted him. And Kennedy, was kind of obviously more timid about accepting the role, especially since he was going to be following in the footsteps of the legend of Jim Carrey and doing The Mask. So he was initially turned it down. He didn't really want to do it. I think he said he turned it down a few times. And eventually New Line persuaded him to sign on, and they basically doubled his offer to do so. So they doubled his offer, and he eventually signed on. I think there's a really great YouTube series that he did on his YouTube channel that he talked about his whole experience from joining the movie and filming the movie and stuff, and even had this really cool podcast with the director talking about their experience of it. It's a really great and fascinating look to the Son of the Mask, but half his team said he didn't want to do it, half his team said he wanted to, and they felt like it was a right or bad move, but he eventually signed on to do it. Now, another big problem that kind of initially pulled him out of doing it is because he was still filming his own TV show, The Jamie Kennedy Experiment, and, that due to the scheduling issues, and they were going to film the movie apparently in Australia, Son of the Mask, that basically he didn't have time to do the movie and shoot it. Eventually, what happened was the producers of the movie in New Line worked with, Jamie Kennedy and the people who did the show and reworked the schedule in such a way so that apparently the movie Son of the Mask was originally supposed to come out in 2004 before it got delayed early on into 2005, but it was apparently supposed to come out in the summer of 2004. The idea was that they were going to basically allocate for this delay. They were basically going to, kind of move forward certain aspects of the TV show in terms of the scheduling and when he would be able to shoot it in such a way so that I guess near the end of the year, I think of 2004 or, 2003. It was going to be the end of 2003 and would wrap at the early part of 2004. they were kind of positioned in a way so that Kennedy could film his show right after he did the movie. So they were basically kind of, to really quickly sum this up, were able to resolve the scheduling differences, and Kennedy was able to do the project. Now, there was also a lot of things as well that, Kennedy was very timid about this whole process. He was also unsure about signing on because he would also have to play the mask himself. But he was eventually persuaded because the movie would really be, kind of in a lot of ways in the final movie, it's not really about the mask in a lot of ways. It's, of course, about the baby stuff more so. And themes of family, and he only be able to play the mask in really the beginning of the movie and at the end, so that kind of persuaded him to sign on. Now, he initially actually didn't even want to play Ted. I think from what I've been hearing in like reports and stuff, he was actually looking to play Loki because he felt like it would be less pressure to do the Loki character. He could be more animated and just kind of do whatever he want with that certain character. While, if he played Ted, he became the mask, there would be this huge expectation to follow up to what Jim Carrey did. But eventually, he was persuaded to just sign on and play Ted due to the story itself and the changes that were made. Now, initially, with the baby concept, while that was being developed, apparently there was an even earlier version of this, version of the sequel that was talked about with Gutterman and Kennedy. Basically, it was going to be similar to the approach that Kennedy had done with his, comedy on his own TV show, where that the mask would have, basically it would be a sequel where Ted's character would play the mask, possibly for majority of the movie, but he would just play multiple characters and personas as he's, when he's the mask. He would play a lady character, maybe a baby character. He would play an old lady. He would play a gunslinger, just kind of like how the Mask comics, where the mask is super animated and would change his appearance and clothing and character style all the time. And that was the initial idea. They were going to do something like that. Now, eventually, that all got dialed back, and the focus of the movie was transitioned to the baby and the idea of family and such. But that was some of the early ideas and concepts they had for it. Now, as the movie was kind of coming together, New Line was very confident in it. Apparently, Kennedy was signed on for this movie with a contract basically stating that he had to do multiple sequels. So if the movie was really successful in some alternate universe and was critically beloved, and they made a Son of the Mask 2, he was contractually obligated if they wanted him to appear in that movie. So I find that really fascinating. It's kind of like Marvel movies, where actors are signed on for multiple movies. He was signed on for sequels. So I find that really fascinating. Now, they shot the movie in Australia, and apparently the shoot was described as kind of difficult, but kind of efficient. They had, of course, the baby character in the movie. They had two babies to kind of use throughout the whole movie. And they had a dog that was named Bear. In the movie, it's called Otis, and which apparently was a reference to the cartoon The Adventures of Milo and Otis. So kind of a really cool, subtle reference of the first movie. And obviously, Ted, Avery, obviously, Tim, Avery, that's kind of a reference to, obviously, the inspiration behind the mask and the cartoony exaggerations. Which, if I've been saying Ted throughout this video, I'm sorry. It's Tim. I'll probably just keep saying Jamie Kennedy's character. That being said, they shot the movie, and apparently it was difficult working with the dog and the babies on set, which is very natural. One of the biggest rules when you're filming a movie, and always one of those unspoken rules, is that you don't work with babies and you don't work with dogs when you're filming a movie, because babies do not care about cue lines and, kind of the line readings and stuff. They're just babies, right? They'll do anything they want and express themselves without any kind of apology or holdback. Same thing with dogs. Dogs are the same exact way. And, it was kind of difficult to have multiple scenes with the baby. And apparently Kennedy said filming very mundane scenes with the dog and the baby and stuff was quite difficult because the baby would be very distracted or cry or just do things that babies normally do, right? So they would have to do take after take. This apparently gave less time for Kennedy to possibly have different versions and different takes of his scenes as the Mask and his comedic bits, because his scenes kind of got pushed towards the end because they had to really shoot and knock out those more mundane scenes with the dog and the baby and such, which were much more difficult to do since obviously the nature of dogs and babies are not inducive to filming a movie. So that was kind of a weird trope and thing about the Son of the Mask filming and production. It was also mentioned too that there was also possibly heavy deadlines and constant script rewrites that were plaguing the shoot. And apparently, it kind of was one of the reasons why the issues with the filming kind of, as they eventually transpired and moved on, it actually delayed the movie because originally the movie was supposed to come out in summer 2004, which is natural. Eventually it got delayed to October 15th of 2004. And, there was also many other things. And there was eventually another delay to February of 2005, which eventually would cause that, the movie to release finally then. But the constant delays were kind of due in fact to the fact that there was a lot of difficulty shooting it. They also had to precisely shoot everything they needed to do to line up with Kennedy's schedule. And obviously the nature of working with babies and dogs is not really fun for filming. Now, I think the other delay to February 2005 was kind of in part to what happened after they were done wrapped up. Because apparently, after they finished shooting the movie, the director locked himself in for about 2 weeks and created his initial edit of the movie. This is where, of course, I'm going to talk about the whole Gutterman cut situation. But the idea was that this was going to be, the original version of the movie was going to be close to 2 hours long. And he compiled it together and was showing certain scenes to New Line Cinema because they were kind of asking for dailies, which apparently when they saw some of the dailies, they were quite impressed. So the studio was positive about this movie, at least during filming. It wasn't really until apparently they compiled a sort of loose editor's director's cut of the movie. Now, this would have been a version of the movie where there would have been not really any special effects fully completed. Certain scenes wouldn't have been completely mastered and properly edited and such. It was a rough draft, if you will. But the studio was really pressuring the director to show anything for the project after filming had wrapped. So he kind of relented and, shown his version of the movie to studio executives and apparently Robert Shea of New Line Cinema, who was the head of the company at that time. And, well, the reaction was not really that positive. Now, what happened was apparently after they saw it, they did the whole thing where they didn't speak about it during the whole movie. They were silent. And then apparently they were told after the fact they needed to chop the movie down and get straight to the point. Get straight to the cartoon hijinks, trim the movie down, and basically make it more family-friendly, more cartoony, get to the more cool parts of the movie, and less of the setup to the jokes. And this kind of more inherently ruined the movie in a lot of ways. Now, the movie itself was already kind of, in my opinion, from concept, kind of doomed, but this even more so made the movie worse. And they chopped the movie down. Even worse, originally the movie was supposed to come out with a PG-13 rating, similar to the first Mask movie. And to kind of more appeal to the kid-friendly market and make it even more family-friendly, so to speak, they chopped the movie down to PG as a rating. And that also required heavily reworking and chopping the movie down. And apparently the director was forced to resent, and eventually we got the version that we got eventually in theaters. It was reported that there was apparently about 38 minutes of the movie chopped away. This was spoken about by Kennedy and the director himself, and they would kind of go on to lament that the director's cut was even more better than the theatrical version, and saying that basically it got rid of a lot of the context and set up for a lot of the jokes that they had planned for the film. So when you see the final movie, it's just the jokes, but there's no planned, there's no setup for the jokes. It feels highly incomplete and compromised. But, the executives at New Line wanted a shorter, more quicker, more, straight to the point cut of the film. So we eventually got the hour-and-a-half version that we got, which was released in theaters. Now, there was also kind of a little bit of a fun fact. Another thing that happened for the post-production is I.L. Elm worked on this movie, famously. They actually crafted a lot of the visual effects. Also, another animation studio called Tippett Studio. And I think Edge FX as well was involved with this to help kind of support and get the visual effects work done for this movie, because there was quite a bit of visual effects work. And they kind of used a lot of live-action animation hybrid techniques that were used on Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Space Jam. In terms of the animation, especially with those uncanny baby scenes and the whole dog and baby stuff, well, obviously Ted Avery was a basis for inspiration. They actually drew much more from the style of Chuck Jones, which is kind of a really interesting thing. And they also kind of used technology they developed for the computer, kind of CGI, computer-generated versions of the scenes with the baby and such from the Women in Snickets, A Series of Unfortunate Events movie, which also ILM worked on. So that's also kind of a cute little fun fact as well. But yeah, the whole thing with them reshooting certain parts also happened with the re-edit of the film and the drastic, chopping down, if you will, that was frantically done after the Robert Shea and the executives didn't like what they saw with the initial director's cut happened, and we eventually got the 2005 film, which massively bombed when it came out and was critically panned. Now let's get into more. Like I said, that was kind of a little bit of a history lesson to the development of this movie. I know it was probably not necessary, but I just wanted to mention it. Now, in terms of concepts that never made it out to the final product. So like I mentioned, the early versions of the movie with Kennedy doing multiple versions of The Mask as a proposed plot point, which initially conceived but quickly dropped. In terms of other ideas and scenes, there was some concept art for different versions of the car that I've seen online, and different versions of the fight between Loki and the Mask as Tim. There's even a scene where I guess they were both holding like giant missiles and they were going to, I guess, shoot them at each other. Obviously, that didn't really make the final cut, but it's a kind of an interesting version of the fight. The hot rod, if you will, that the Mask uses at the end to kind of chase after Loki, kind of went through different versions and concepts. And there was even concept art for a Loki alternative. It was kind of designed as a Loki-style Mustang. So maybe there would have been at one point, instead of the car that we got for Loki in the final film, he would have had some kind of green-styled Mustang that was kind of similar and cartoony like the Mask's vehicle, which would have been really cool. It's a shame we never got to see that. Also, they have some concept art for Otis the dog when he becomes the Mask here, and it looks pretty similar to the final version. It seemed like they did, clay mode, kind of clay molds of it, and CGI, renditions of it, and he looks very cartoony in appearance, basically like the final film. So there's not really too many huge differences. And now let's get into the really unfortunate cutscene that I think personally, and I do heavily disagree with the director and Kennedy on this one, the sperm scene. Yes. Now, what the hell am I talking about? The sperm scene. What is that? Now, this technically did come out. If you saw the movie in Europe, in France, and Britain, those cuts of the movie for Son of the Mask included a scene where, in the movie, Tim as the Mask would race up to the bedroom and go with his wife, and they would do it. Now, that was all the, cut scenes that we got. Now, there was apparently a scene after that I'm not sure if it surfaced online, but, wife of Tim would, I guess, the morning after they did it in bed as Tim as the Mask, would, I guess, just say some very provocative stuff and get on top of him and such, which that never made it to the final film since the film was heavily censored and put down to PG. That being said, there would have been an additional scene in between where we would have seen Mask sperm. You heard those words correctly. Mask sperm reaching into the woman's area in the body, the whole process of forming a baby, the process of fertilization. You would have seen that. And it was a fully completed, rendered scene in the movie. Now, if you've seen it, it's online. It was included in some European cuts. It's a bizarre sequence where like these three masked sperms are reaching the egg, and the whole process of fertilization in the woman's body happens. And I'm just out of words. I mean, that was literally a scene they planned for this movie. Now, there was some concept art done for this, and I included it on the bottom right of this picture for this video, and it's even more creepy than the final scene. Like, there's concepts for this that included Eddie Murphy, an Eddie Murphy style face for one of the masked sperm, and another face that looks really creepy on it. I mean, what were they thinking? Now, I don't know if this concept art is legit, so I'm going to pour that into the video, give you a little bit of a grain of salt. Hopefully it isn't real, but it seems legit. That was an early concept for this scene. A Eddie Murphy style masked sperm in a woman. I mean, just, I can't believe I'm saying these words. Like who needed this? It is awful. It is one of the worst things I've ever seen in any kind of movie in my life. Horrendous. There's also some pretty interesting versions too. Like, it seemed like there was a concept for Loki that, in the movie itself, we saw him use those famous finger guns at the very beginning of the movie. It seemed like a concept of it would have been, it's kind of a concept that we did see in the final film, but he would have transformed his appearance to be more green with black stripes over. And some early concept art showed him like this, but his face and his appearance would have been very similar to the mask. So I'm kind of glad they changed it up. They gave him some wild-looking hair and obviously made him look up different from the mask, because you would have two green dudes looking similar. That would be really confusing for the audience. But yeah, pretty cool stuff with that concept art, but the sperm concept art is just infamous. It is horrific. It is one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. But yes, there was a sperm scene, and it did make it to some versions of the movie. Now, this was apparently part of the director's cut as well, as Kennedy and the director would speak on it. Like, they would say, like, it's so weird. If you watch the podcast interview, they say initially, oh yeah, that wasn't a part of the movie. But then they later in the podcast would say, oh yeah, that was a part of it. And you would have seen it. It would have been natural. I have to heavily disagree with them. This is a bizarre sequence, and I'm really glad it never made it in. It is just awful, and it's one of the worst parts of the movie. I didn't even know it existed because I never saw the movie in Europe. But just horrendous. It's an infamous scene. Like, who asked for this? Like, the humor is so insane. Obviously, for obvious reasons, it never made it to a PG version in America. How it made it in the European version, I don't know. Maybe they just missed it. But bizarre. Like, it's one of those attempts at adult comedy. Like, I get it, what they were coming from, but this is not how you should do adult comedy, man. Like, Toy Story has more of the subtle adult commentary, if you actually watch that movie. It's a kid's movie, but there's some subtle adult jabs. This is not it, mate. This is not it. Now, he also, like I said, there was a so-called director's cut for this movie that had apparently 38 minutes of footage cut. Now, there is a lot of deleted scenes and alternate scenes that were released with the DVD. I think there was a total of like 19, and these are basically a compiled list of alternate takes and deleted scenes. Now, I was able to watch all 19 of them for this video, and I gotta be honest, I think some of them really work, and I think a lot of jokes here should have been left in the movie. For example, I'm kind of just gonna name drop examples. There's a scene where Tim's character meets with his friend at the animation studio he's working at. And there's a cut scene where basically we get a little bit more of their dialogue. We also establish that his friend likes this girl that works in the office. And that would have been a setup for a joke that was later played on and included in the final version, where when Tim shows up as the mask and changes everything into that really weird dance number, that the girl would have fallen into his friend's arms. That would have been set up, which I think that should have been left in the movie. It doesn't make sense why that was cut out. There's also a scene where Tim is looking up on the second floor of the animation studio, and, that would have been set up for the whole thing, where eventually Tim gets the chance to become an animator, and he kind of freaks out. He's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to the second floor. That would have been set up. So I think, overall, I think that this version of the movie, the director's cut, I think would have been better naturally, just because it would have set up elements and plot beats that would have been later paid off in the movie because they were introduced earlier, which I think absolutely would have made a much more better viewing experience. And like I said, there's certain scenes I think should have been left in the movie, and why they weren't is kind of beyond me. But I do think there are certain versions and cut down scenes that I do think, like, it's a mixed bag. I think certain scenes should have been left in, certain things I think absolutely should have been left out. I already mentioned this, but the sperm scene. I'm glad that got cut. I'm not sure why that was included. It is super bizarre and weird. There's also a scene where Tim is getting made fun of as the turtle because he's kind of like the turtle mascot at the animation studio he's working at. And a bunch of kids just kind of make fun of them. And one of the kids says something like really mean and serious to him. And I feel like, yeah, it kind of establishes Tim as more of a lazy, just a guy that's really a kind of a screw up, right? He could be potentially a lot more better what stuff he's doing, but, he's not reaching his full potential. I just thought the scene with the kid was a bit cringy, though. I just think it was, number one, a kid that young wouldn't even say something that serious to someone like an adult. But two, I don't think it's okay. It's a decent scene, but I am kind of glad they cut it out. Like I said, I'm just going to be vague with the descriptions for certain scenes. They're on YouTube. You can watch these extended, deleted scenes. There's also an extended scene where Tim shows up first as the Mask and does the whole IV joke. And my gosh, I am really glad they cut out this portion of the scene for the final film. So he shows up, and the first thing I think he says to the guy that's kind of the bodyguard and the guy that's blocking access to the employee club that he's showing up, he says, Tim's character says, "Smoking," which causes cancer, or something like that. Obviously a callback to when Jim Carrey shows up as the Mask at the club in the first movie. God damn, what a horrible scene. Like, not even a good callback at all. It's just such a strange and bizarre scene, and it kind of goes on for too long, and I am kind of glad that the final version that we got was much more cut down and straight to the point. I'm not sure why, this was done the way it was done. It just doesn't work. It just does not work. So yeah, that was a pretty awful deleted scene. There's also further scenes, like there's kind of, more, like I said, the director's cut, especially if you look at the deleted scenes, are just in general more provocative than the final film, which I think overall makes for a better version of the movie for sure. But I also think some of the deleted scenes, I also just think don't really add too much or anything substantial. To kind of continue with some of the major differences, there's some alternate versions where Tim's wife arrives at different points than originally proposed in the movie. I think she would arrive during the daytime in this kind of version of it, then at nighttime in the final version. Also, there would have been an additional scene where what we basically would have been able to figure out after Loki got his power stripped from Odin, he would have then, I guess, gone to some kind of pet shop to gather up certain materials and things he needed to basically summon the ability to talk to his father. And he would have basically had a whole conversation with this black pet shop owner lady who gives him attitude. And I guess Loki, obviously being a god, doesn't have money to buy the stuff. And I guess there's a humorous scene where, like, he's attempting to hit on her, and then she has him basically clean up poop in the back to kind of pay for things that he needs. I guess it's a somewhat humorous scene, and I guess it gives you some background to how Loki got some of the materials to talk to his father in the first place, but, it's not really that important of a scene. I think it, like I said, it could have been cut out, and nothing would have been lost. Like, you could just make assumptions of how he got the material, so it doesn't really add anything. There's also a weird scene where, part of the whole search for the baby that Loki does, where he's talking to multiple people and stuff, he talks to this one lady who has a really Tim Burton style pink house and is trying to sell her on a crazy vacuum. And there's a slightly extended portion of it where I guess, there's some sexual tension, or she's kind of hitting on him. I'm not sure. But, that could have possibly been left in, but it doesn't really add anything substantial or really make the scene too much better, at least in my opinion. So there's a couple scenes like that. I think overall it makes for a better version of the movie, especially with certain elements that are set up and, kind of followed up on later. Well, in the final film, those versions and plot points that were set up, those scenes were cut out, which I think was a huge issue for the movie that we got in the final result. But I think it's a mixed bag. There are also just, like I said, plenty of other scenes that I think are bizarre and don't really add too much to the movie. Like I said, the Loki pet shop scene. I'm not sure what the point of that was. Like, did we really need a scene? Really need to see a scene where Loki, without his powers, hits on a black lady? No, like we didn't really need to see that. And of course, I don't really need to explain why the sperm mask scene did not need to be in the final film. Such a bizarre scene, and it just so strange that it even made it as far as it did. But yeah, I mean, those are kind of major gists of the alternate deleted scenes. I mean, they're like I said, they're all on YouTube. You can check them out. And, like I said, I think they are a mixed bag. And I think that's really what my opinion of the supposed Gutterman cut. Now, there has been no Gutterman cut leaked online. I would love to see a fan edit where someone would attempt to add the alternate scenes and deleted scenes into the version of the movie that we got. Just because I think overall it would have made for a much more better viewing experience. Just like I said, kind of like a Snyder cut or some kind of fan edit, like, a lot of films have online. I think that'll be really cool. And I still think, even with these delete alternate scenes, the film is much better for it. I think, like I said, there's setup for jokes that are there and plot points that are just really not there in the final film. But I will just say that it overall does not save the movie. I think that the movie as a concept from the very beginning was kind of flawed at its execution. And while I think that, would have been a better film if the Gutterman cut made it and got released, I think it would have not saved the movie. It just would have been probably a slightly better version of the movie. Maybe a version of the movie that people would have gave a second chance to when it was immediately, disavowed when it came out. Now, there's also a Gutterman cut. We know there is. The director spoke about it in a podcast with Jamie Kennedy. Apparently said this is the version that I think he said that he shown the New Line executives when they first compiled the movie, or at least maybe one of the edits that he was working on after the fact, and said that it was a much better movie. And, there is a cut out there, but it's not been able to release, obviously, for legal reasons. Even though I would love if someone would just, not saying I support piracy, but if someone would leak it, that would be fantastic. But, yeah, that was pretty much most of the cut content. A lot of the alternate deleted scenes, the Gutterman cut, which according to the comments made by Kennedy and Gutterman, basically said that the movie would have flowed better. It would have had setup for jokes. The pacing would have been a lot better. It also been a little bit more risky with its material, since it would have been a PG-13 movie instead of a PG movie, the film that we ultimately got. And, just would have been a much more consistent, tonally, artistically better of a film. So, that's kind of a lot of the descriptions they were talking about. And if you watch the podcast, they also kind of talk about a lot of the deleted scenes and things that we did, like I said before, we know were in the movie, but just never made the cut. And like I said before, I think a lot of it is made available due to the fact that so many deleted and alternate scenes were put on the DVD, but who knows? I mean, there could have been even more stuff cut from the DVD that we still don't get. Like the scene, I think, with, like I said before, the wife of Tim, I guess being more risky with him after the morning that he did it with her and the whole, as the mask. I don't know if that's in the delete scenes. So, they talk about it in the podcast. So it's kind of a really interesting thing, the whole we discussed and everything. But yeah. In terms of a Son of the Mask 2, is there also any information on that? Even though we know Kennedy signed on, and part of his contract was for sequels, and I guess New Line Cinema was hyping up that, yeah, we're thinking about sequels, it's going to be a big franchise. Obviously, none of that happened, and the film bombed, it was critically panned, and, I mean, it seemed like there was no movement at all for a sequel, which makes sense. And that was all the information I could find on that. So to kind of quickly wrap up this video, since I'm already talking about this movie for way too long than it really deserves, my overall opinions on the cut content for Son of the Mask. I think some of the cut content is pretty cool, and I wish we got it in the final film. I think the Loki Mustang in particular would have been really cool. It's like this super cool green stylish vehicle. I wish made it to the final film. But on one hand, the Eddie Murphy inspired horrific, design of my nightmares, really, the mask sperm. I mean, that whole scene, the fact that it even made it to a cut of the movie is insane and absolutely horrific. So, kind of a mixed bag. I think I've already mentioned this, but the Gutterman cut, I think overall would have been a better movie. It would have been, much more better paced. There just would have been better setup for jokes, but it would have not saved the movie. And in some instances, especially with certain additions of certain scenes, possibly would have made it worse. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, but I think overall it would have made it for a better film. But this isn't a Snyder Cut situation where that film actually had material and hours of possible film to be put back in and actually made for a very different movie. This just really would have slightly made the movie better, but maybe, in my opinion, not saved it. So yeah, that's kind of my overall, kind of to quickly wrap this up, opinions on the cut content, the supposed Gutterman cut, the director's cut of Son of the Mask. This film that's obviously pretty infamous and been roasted on by so many other YouTubers, including myself with my review, even though I do find qualities in it that I really like. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of talk about the canceled and cut content, the director's cut of Son of the Mask, and give you also some interesting tidbits about the production. I found this to be a really interesting video, something that, no one has really talked about, and I'm probably going to be the only one to mention it. And I just thought it was all really fascinating stuff and just wanted to kind of make a canceled video for it. If you're able to listen all the way through, thank you. I definitely make videos for all of y'all to enjoy, and I always enjoy the support. Definitely comment. I see all the comments on these videos and always sometimes occasionally respond to them. And, thank you for all the support lately. All right, hopefully you have a good day, and peace, y'all.